hop on a train to head down to the Art Institute of Chicago. That's how I recommend that you get there. This is going to be the best way to avoid paying a whole bunch of parking fees. Anyway, here's my train. Gotta hop on. If you take the train, which I highly recommend, you want to get off here at Adams and Wabash. That'll put you right there in front of the museum, and you can't miss it from there. There's several different entrances into the museum, but this is the one that you want to look for. It's the one that's got the giant lions right there. It's almost always a big line here, so make sure you get here in time, enough extra time ahead so that you don't miss the beginning of the tour. Make sure you get here about 10-15 minutes early. That should be enough. After you pay your fare over there, I want you to come and meet me on the stairs over here. I'll be right up there at the top of the stairs. Just meet me here as soon as possible and right on time. Maybe even a little bit early. All right, see you then. This week we have to be outside. A couple reasons. First of all, it's beautiful outside. Steamy hot, beautiful summer day. But also because we're discussing Impressionism. You can't really discuss Impressionism without going outside. Most of the paintings were made outside in the sun, in the wind, in nature, in plein air, right? This is the French term for painting outside, basically. There's a couple of reasons why painters are able to go outside. Part of it has to do with the Industrial Revolution. Suddenly, paint is in tubes. If paint is in a tube, then I can take it anywhere. I don't have to sit right where I've mixed it. Instead, I can just take it outside, squirt a little bit on my palette, and go to work. But the plein air isn't the only subject for this week. Another key subject is the simple fact that the Industrial Revolution, the most recent revolution, we started with the Renaissance, which was one revolution. That was a revolution of thought. The second type of revolution that we discussed was a political revolution. This time it's an industrial revolution, a machine revolution. And that revolution brings us tubes of paint. It brings us trains that can take us from Amsterdam to Paris, from Italy to Paris. But the Industrial Revolution kicked off a whole chain of events that brought us to this series of paintings. One of the key machines that came along in the Industrial Revolution was the camera. The camera was a machine that made images. They could capture every detail that light bounced off of, that landed in that camera. We're going to be discussing that quite a bit this week. But the third thing that we're going to be discussing this week is abstraction. Just basic abstraction. Next week we'll be discussing intense abstraction. This week, just basic abstraction. And the form of abstraction that we're going to be discussing this week is simplification abstraction. How many details are necessary? Which details are you going to choose to render? This week we're going to be looking at painters choosing to reference just light and shadow and not worry so much about every individual button, every individual rivet, but instead just the impressions, the basic necessary information to communicate an idea. So if painting is a task of trying to capture light, because light affects your eye and allows you to see things, then what better place is there to paint than outside, where you have natural light, where you have sunshine that can both illuminate the subjects that you're trying to paint and can illuminate the surface that you're painting on, allowing you to see exactly the best version of what this painting is going to look like. The painters of the Impressionism were famous for going outside, partly because they had the tubes of paint that allowed them to travel. They didn't have to sit and mix the paint on the spot. Pre-made canvases and basically grab a canvas, grab an easel, grab a couple tubes of paint, go out onto a hillside and paint what you see. Partly because of the fact that they're painting outside, in many cases the objective was to finish the painting while the sun was just like that, or while the grass was just like that, trying to capture the entire painting in one sitting as opposed to laboring over it for months and months and months. Not to say the painters didn't go back in the studio and fix things up afterwards, but in many cases the idea was to grab the impression in the spot. Hello. Now in week 2 we discussed how the camera was being used by a lot of painters in the Renaissance and in the 19th century. You got to figure that if these guys are going out into the plein air, out into the wide open spaces, that there's actually no way that they could possibly use the camera in the paintings in the same way that the people that were painting inside used them. Inside, you've already got a dark room, and you can use that dark room to be able to do these projections. When you're outside in plein air, there's no way to do that. Well, in fact, there is. You put a big hood over top of you and you set up the thing, but then you may as well expose it onto a silver plate and call it a photograph, right? In some cases, because of the Industrial Revolution, you've got machines doing menial labor that humans used to have to do. If you've got a machine that's taking care of some of that stuff, then all of a sudden you've got a little leisure time. It might mean you might take a vacation. You might go to the seaside. And if you're already leisuring, you might choose to capture that. And of course, you could capture that in with the newfangled camera. But you could also capture this, beautiful free time with another free time. This free time of just sort of sitting out in the open air and painting, documenting a little bit of the beauty that's in your world, sharing it with another person. But the document in this case isn't necessarily about the idea of creating a factual, realistic truth. This is finally art, right? Prior to that, a lot of the process that was going into the act of painting was documentation or specific storytelling. It was sort of a craft, a high craft that somebody studied so that they could tell a particular type of story. At this point, with the machine that can do the more accurate job of rendering reality, the painters are suddenly in a position that they're making images for kind of the same reason a poet is making a poem. A poet isn't telling a history, perhaps there might be history in the poem, but he's not telling a history, he's making a creative use of words. And in this case, the painters are suddenly making creative uses of images, creative uses of light. And they're suddenly making art out of it as opposed to just making a truth or a document out of it. How each person does it differently becomes the trick. If you've ever been to a chili cook-off, it's not the fact that this person made the chili, it's the fact that they made their chili in a really interesting way. And their chili is what you're sort of excited to eat when you're comparing it to your chili or to your grandma's chili or to your father's chili, which are all a little bit different. And it's the differences based on a basic similar sort of function. They're all making chili. But the whole point is that you're making your own original version, your own specific personalized version. Same thing that guy's doing, He's not trying to create exactly the same painting as the guy back there. He's trying to create his version of it. It's because sometimes it's interesting to have something that's an exaggerated reality. Now this is where my interest in history and art sort of collide. I was really torn, as I said before, between the idea of studying history in college and studying art. My biggest problem, of course, was that I never necessarily wanted to tell just the story. I like to embellish. I like to add additional facts and tricks and moral stories into some of my stories, and therefore it just made more sense to do art if I wasn't going to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Well, this is to some level my interpretation of the shadow reflecting off the brick and the vines here against the doorway. It's more of a momentary interpretation of the feeling of the environment rather than a specific attempt to capture the image itself.
Abstraction is a basic hallmark of modern art. Almost all modern art has some level of abstraction built into it. But we're going to start with the simplest form. This is this idea of what is necessary to communicate an idea. Now, a perfectly rendered human being must, if you really want to show reality, should include everything like eyelashes and boogers in our nose and every single whisker on our chin and fingernails and toenails, because that's what a real human has. But it's not always necessary to include all of that information. It's not absolutely necessary if you paint a horizon to include every blade of grass. And in fact, in most cases, you don't necessarily want all of that information because it's going to start to distract the eye and grab your eye and make you look at this or make you look at that. Abstraction's a complicated issue, and it's one of the things that many times really confuses new people looking at art. I don't get it. When I look at it, I don't even see what it is this artist is trying to communicate. The more abstract an image becomes, the more it's necessary to look at it in a different way. When I think of abstraction, I'm normally thinking of it as a scale. And on one end of the scale, you've got something completely recognizable and perhaps extraordinarily accurate. And on the other end of the scale, you've got something that's barely recognizable, if recognizable at all. Completely non-representational over here and extraordinarily representational over here. Now, if this is a scale, in between you've got lots of different dots, right? Perhaps on this end of the scale you've got Caravaggio where it's hyper-accurate, right? A few steps in you might have somebody like Van Gogh or Monet, you know? Way on the other end of the scale you might have somebody like Jackson Pollock or Mark Rothko, somebody who completely unrecognizable. Andy Warhol, maybe closer to this end, recognizable, soup can sort of thing. Somebody like Picasso, maybe a few clicks over here towards the more unrecognizable. Modern art in many ways comes because there's a machine that communicates reality better, so artists are liberated to try something else. And one of the first things they do is they get to make some decisions, and some of the first decisions that they make are what needs to be there. What information can I keep and what information can I lose? If you go on the tour of the Museum of Art, one of the first things that we'll start looking at in early artworks are details. Details like fingernails or toenails. The reason I like to do this is that it allows you to see whether an artist has decided to include all of the intricate details. When we look at Caravaggio style paintings, we're going to be seeing not only fingernails and toenails, but also like dirt under the fingernails, toe jam, right? Because that's a lot of information, and it's information that's really there. When we look at paintings of this era, we're going to be seeing a lot less of those unnecessary details. We're going to be allowing artists to decide which details to show you, which things that they can remove, which things, if they simplify a human being, do you need every eyelash? Do you need every hair in the eyebrow? Do you need every piece of hair on the head? Do you need to include glistens of sweat? Or can you just communicate basic ideas of there's light over here and there's shadow over here, and that might be enough? Can we allow painters to do something different? Well, they almost have to do something different. The invention of the camera took over their primary job of rendering reality. And if there's a machine that can do it better than you, or a machine that can do it in a more accurate way, then is it necessary for you to do that? Some painters will continue to do that. But some painters will start to explore, experiment. And among the very first experiments are simplification. Simplification abstraction is one of the easier forms of abstraction to understand because it's the form of abstraction that you probably use more than any other. A stick figure is a very simple simplification abstraction of a human being. Abstraction is what's going to allow artists to communicate a lot and to really explore certain topics without being bogged down by all the details. Here's some of that abstract art. Just smears of color blended together on the surface, interacting with the other colors on the surface. This is an image of a pregnant woman. This is not an abstract thought, but this is abstract art. Everybody knows what a pregnant woman is. Everybody knows what needs to be there to communicate it. But how are we going to get to that image? These are hands. Do I need to have fingernails to communicate pregnant woman? Not really. I do need to have a belly though. And I do need to have a woman. Now, I didn't want this painting to be completely abstract. And in fact, I used that old projector trick. I used a video projector to project this image onto here to make sure that all of the proportions were right based on a photograph that I had taken. But I did want there to be some levels of abstraction. I wanted it to be a painting and not a photo. I already had the photo. There's tons of information that is there in terms of color and line and shapes. there's also a lot of information that is not there. Like, where are some of the features? Where's information about the rest of her nostril, or information about her eyeball? There's basic lighting, basic color information, and it's sort of done in a fairly sketchy way, as opposed to being hyper-accurate, thin layers of individual paint. This is as much about this texture that accumulates here, and the fact that this is rough and this is smooth, as it is the fact that it's a face. There's lots of different things that you can explore in paint besides reality. One thing is surface. And a lot of the paintings that I've been working on most recently are playing off of certain impressionist sort of inspirations, because I'm really interested in playing with the texture of paint and the simplification of the image. See these heavy black outlines that are going through everything? That's another form of abstraction. It's a simplification. It's sort of creating a simple separation between this lighter color and this redder color. I've basically said this is one object which is separated from this object using this abstraction of a thick, heavy black outline. Totally got the inspiration for that from Paul Cézanne. He's a impressionist painter of the time period that we're discussing right now, and that's when I walk through the museum and I see his paintings, that's what I almost always want to come home and try. You were born during the digital revolution, where suddenly there's an app for everything. You've got one machine that just has all of these individual software things that each is a different tool that does something different. This city was born during the Industrial Revolution. It's basically one giant machine that's got all these individual parts, each capable of doing something slightly different. You've got one machine that's being used to create another machine that's being used to create that tower, right? You've got other machines designed to bring the cargo in on the water, on the rails. Machines are being built to build machines that are being built to build machines that are being built to build machines. It's a cycle of mechanics. One person's invention is being added to another person's invention, and now all of a sudden we have another huge explosion. Now, there's always been machines, simple machines, but during the Industrial Revolution, you start to get electric machines, mechanical machines, machines that require fuels to be able to run. The combustion engine is built. The electrical power generators are built. Electricity can not only be stored, but it can be used in a million different ways. You also have liberty. This came from the previous revolution, but part of the thing that came out of the previous revolution were new governments that tried to not only have the extremely poor and the extremely wealthy, but a middle class. All of a sudden, people have a little disposable income, a little bit of extra cash, and that extra cash allows them to do things like take a day off, sit around and think, come up with new ideas, and some of these new ideas become the new machines, the new inventions. Inventors are going crazy all over the world at this time. People are exploring, people are experimenting, and people are inventing, and people are industrializing the entire world, completely reinventing some of the basic understandings of what it is to be human. To be human does not necessarily mean that you have to spend all day hunting and gathering, but instead it could mean that you can spend all day thinking and conceptualizing. Cities like the one that you're looking at right now exploded during the Industrial Revolution. This town was a tiny little village, right? And all of a sudden exploded into this enormous metropolis that we know right now, partly because it was a crossroads for machines. It was a place where all of these giant machines, these trains, would come together, drop off goods from one location, pick up goods from another location, and move them from one place to another. If you wanted to eat fish, you didn't necessarily have to live by the water anymore. You could live in the heartland, and you could get goods and services from all over the world. Industrial Revolution is not only the process of making machines, but it's the process of moving goods and services from one location to another. A lot of people moved from one location to another too. People moved from the countryside to the city because they could get a job, and with a job, they get working in one of these factories or working in building some of these buildings. With a job like this, they could all of a sudden have some disposable income. The middle class exploded during this time, and the middle class were the people that were buying some of these machines that people were creating. And that middle class is what gives us things like consumers. Consumers are necessary to to drive invention and to drive productivity. Because without people consuming them, people aren't going to be making new ones. And without people to consume them, people aren't going to make better ones. And without people consuming them, people aren't going to know what people need next. If you think about it, go back to this digital revolution for a second. Without the digital revolution, if people didn't buy the computers, nobody would be selling software. The Industrial Revolution started with machines taking over some of the hard labor and eventually drove humans to do other things with their brains. Some inventions changed the way people see, some inventions changed the way people think, some inventions changed the way people operate. The camera, to a certain degree, is one that's sort of done all of those. The same with those tubes of paint. They changed the way painters operate, and they eventually changed the way people even think about paint. It changes one fundamental thing. The painting, which used to be an image, you would look at something and say, that's Jesus, not a painting of Jesus. Now all of a sudden it switches. Those aren't sunflowers, that's a painting of sunflowers. The object shifts a little bit. It's not so much an image anymore, now it's an object. And part of the reason that that happened was because of the invention of the camera, which was a product of the Industrial Revolution, which was a product of liberty and freedom that we learned about last week.